History loves a warrior culture. We put them on motivational posters and make movies where they have six-pack abs and speak in one-liners. But if you actually lived in their societies, you would realize something terrifying. These were not just soldiers, they were members of a death cult. On one side, the Spartans, the original totalitarian state, where individualism was a disease and obedience was the only cure. On the other, the Vikings, a people who believed a peaceful death was a cosmic failure. We are not asking who would win a fight. That's for internet forums. We are asking, which society was actually crazier? Who was more committed to the bit? Who took the concept of a warrior society and pushed it into the realm of absolute insanity? This is Sparta versus the Vikings. Round 1. Whose childhood was more traumatic? If you were born a Spartan, your very first performance review happened minutes after birth. Elders inspected you for weakness. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, if you were too small or looked frail, the state simply rejected you. You were deemed unworthy to become a soldier. Modern archaeologists dispute the details, but the fact that the Spartans told this story about themselves reveals their terrifying priorities. If you survived that, congratulations, you made the cut. But at age 7, the state took you from your parents and put you in the agoge. This was basically a military boarding school run by sociopaths. By age 12, they took away your tunic and gave you one cloak for the whole year to toughen you up. They starved you to encourage stealing. If you stole food and got away with it, you were praised for your cunning. If you got caught, you were beaten, not for stealing, but for being bad at it. There is a famous story about a boy who hid a stolen fox under his cloak. To avoid being caught, he silently endured the pain of its bites until he collapsed, choosing death over the shame of failure. That is the level of brainwashing we are dealing with. But the highlight was the Sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. Here, they piled cheese on an altar and told the boys to steal it. While they tried, older men with whips struck them. The point wasn't the cheese. The point was to test their resilience and ability to endure pain without flinching. It was a brutal initiation into a life of suffering. Viking childhood was rough, but mostly because you lived in a frozen wasteland where everything, from the weather to the wolves, wanted to kill you. You learned to fight, sail, and farm. You played rough games, but you generally got to keep your skin. Their trauma was environmental. The Spartans legalized theirs. The Vikings taught you to survive the world. The Spartans taught you that the world was a punishment you had to endure. Spartans take round 1. The Vikings raised warriors. The Spartans raised trauma victims with a cheese fixation. 1-0, Sparta. Round 2. Whose rituals were more horrific? Let's talk about the Cryptia. This was the Spartan secret police, but for teenagers. As a final exam, the most promising Spartan boys were sent into the countryside with daggers and no food. Their mission? Murder. Specifically, they were ordered to hunt and kill Helots, the state slaves. They didn't just kill the rebellious ones. They targeted the strongest and smartest, effectively pruning the population like a gardener weeding a flower bed. It was state-sponsored serial killing as a rite of passage. To make it legal, the Ephors would declare war on the Helots every single year, just so killing them wouldn't be considered a crime. It was a bureaucratic loophole for mass murder. The Vikings have their own horror story, the Blood Eagle. Legends describe a ritual to honor Odin or exact vengeance. They cut open a victim's back, hacked the ribs from the spine with an axe, and pulled the lungs out to look like wings. It sounds like the cover of a heavy metal album. But here's the catch. Historians are not sure it ever happened. It might just be poetic exaggeration in the sagas, or anti-Viking propaganda written by terrified monks who wanted to make the Northmen look like demons. A 2021 study confirmed the ritual was anatomically possible, but whether it was actually carried out remains debated. There is no archaeological evidence for it. No rib cages have been found snapped open like that. The Cryptia, however, was very real. It was written into Spartan law. They institutionalized sociopathy. Spartans take round 2. The Blood Eagle is a maybe. The Cryptia was a government program. 2-0, Sparta. Round 3. Whose battlefield psychology was more unhinged? When the Vikings went to war, some of them went into a trance-like fury known as the Berserker Gang. They bit their shields, howled like wolves, and reportedly felt no pain. Science suggests they might have been high on henbane, a plant that causes delirium, hallucinations, and rage. Or maybe magic mushrooms. Basically, they were chemically enhanced shock troops who were too high to know they were dying. They fought with the reckless abandon of a drunk man in a bar fight, but with axes. The Spartans did the opposite. They didn't get high, they got sober. Before a battle, while the enemy was screaming and banging shields, the Spartans sat in silence. They groomed their hair, they oiled their skin, and when they marched, they didn't scream. They walked in perfect, terrifying step to the sound of flute players. This wasn't rage, it was professional disassociation. They treated a massacre like a synchronized swimming routine. When the Persians told them their arrows would blot out the sun, the Spartan Dienekes just shrugged and said, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." That isn't bravery. That is a man who is completely dead inside. They killed with the emotional detachment of a combine harvester. A berserker is scary because he's crazy and might eat your face. A Spartan phalanx is scary because they look like they are checking items off a to-do list while they stab you. Vikings take round 3. The Spartans were professionals. The berserkers were actual lunatics on performance-enhancing drugs. 2-1. Round 4. Whose view on women was more utilitarian? Viking women had it tough, but they had rights. They could own land, they could divorce their husbands if they were mistreated, or even just for wearing shirts that were cut too low. Essentially, for looking effeminate. True story. And legend tells of shield maidens, women who fought alongside men. While historians debate the frequency, graves of armed women suggest it wasn't just a myth. They had agency. They were people. Spartan women were the most liberated in Greece, but for a very specific reason: eugenics. They were trained in athletics, wrestling, javelin, running, and according to Plutarch, they competed naked just like the men. Why? Not for feminism, but because the state believed strong mothers make strong warriors. They were essentially part of a state-run breeding program. Plutarch tells us that if an older man had a young wife, he was encouraged to lend her to a younger, fitter man to produce better children. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about genetic output. Women were valued, but mostly as the factories of the state. If you weren't producing soldiers, you weren't pulling your weight. Spartans take round 4. Viking women were partners. Spartan women were biological assets in a totalitarian machine. 3-1. Round 5. Who feared a bad death more? For a Viking, the worst thing wasn't pain. It was the straw death. Dying in your bed of old age or sickness meant you didn't go to Valhalla. You went to Helheim, a cold, boring underworld ruled by a half-dead giantess. Imagine training your whole life to be a warrior, surviving 100 battles, and then dying of the flu, only to spend eternity in a damp basement. This belief terrified them. Old warriors would reportedly cut themselves or ask to be killed just to avoid the shame of a peaceful death. They were terrified of comfort. The Spartans feared something else: social anxiety. A Spartan who fled battle or showed cowardice became a trembler. You weren't executed. That would be too easy. Instead, you became a social pariah. You had to shave half your beard, just half, so everyone knew you were a failure. You had to wear silly clothes. Anyone could beat you in the street, and you couldn't fight back. No one would talk to you. You were a ghost in your own city. The Vikings feared a boring afterlife. The Spartans feared a life of awkward haircuts and public shaming. Vikings take round 5. Cutting yourself to avoid dying in a comfortable bed is the definition of a death cult. 3-2. Round 6. Whose funeral was more insane? When a Spartan died, the state didn't care much. In fact, they banned elaborate funerals. You didn't get a headstone with your name on it, unless you met specific criteria. Men only got a named grave if they died in battle. Women only got one if they died in childbirth, though scholars debate the exact translation. The message was clear. Your life only mattered if you died serving the state's biological or military machine. If you died of old age, you were a waste of resources, recycled into the earth without a whisper. Now, let's look at a Viking funeral. We have an eyewitness account from Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who watched a Rus chieftain's funeral in the early 10th century. It wasn't a somber affair. It was a 10-day party. They pulled his ship onto land, they sacrificed a dog, 2 horses, 2 cows, and a rooster. And then things got dark. A slave girl volunteered to join him. She spent days drinking and singing. On the final day, she was led to the ship, where she was ritually killed by an old woman called the Angel of Death. They made a lot of noise by beating shields so her screams wouldn't scare other slave girls in the future. Then, they set the whole ship on fire. Spartans ignored you when you died. Vikings threw a burning festival of murder, animal sacrifice, and property destruction. Vikings take round 6. The Spartan funeral is depressing bureaucracy. The Viking funeral is a horror movie with an unlimited budget. 3 all. Round 7. Whose death cult ate itself alive? In 1066, a Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada sailed to England with roughly 300 ships. He took an arrow to the throat at Stamford Bridge. Of those 300 ships, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. This marked the end of the Viking Age. But the Vikings did not collapse. They converted. The death cult was replaced, not destroyed. Their descendants became the Normans and the founders of Kievan Rus. They assimilated. They survived. Now, Sparta. At its peak, the Spartiate warrior class numbered 8,000 men. By the time they fought Thebes at Leuctra in 371 BC, that number had dropped to around 1,500. They lost. Their king died on the field, and they never recovered. Aristotle called it Oliganthropia, a shortage of men. The death cult worked perfectly. It produced elite soldiers. It also produced fewer and fewer of them. Their entire economy depended on slaves they terrorized, and their citizen count depended on a rigid inheritance system that kicked people out if they lost their land. Sparta did not fall to an enemy. It consumed itself. The perfect death cult achieved the perfect death. Spartans take round 7. Vikings adapted. Spartans subtracted. 4-3. The verdict. The score is 4-3. Sparta wins the title of crazier death cult. The Vikings were brutal, but their brutality was emotional. They were driven by faith and glory. They were wild, theatrical, and human. The Spartans were brutal because they did the math. They murdered slaves for policy. They hardened children for curriculum. They dictated who you could marry and how you had to die. They were a death cult of administration. And that is the terrifying difference. You can understand a Viking in a rage, but you cannot reason with a Spartan who has calculated that your death improves the state's efficiency. Institutionalized, cold-blooded, bureaucratic insanity takes the crown. The Spartans win. If you are glad you weren't born in the Agoge, shield wall that subscribe button. If you think I was too hard on the Vikings, let me know in the comments. And remember, never trust a government that worries about your beard.